Hey, what's up, everybody? As promised, finally, we're getting to the High Republic issue number 5, and we're gonna do it right now.
You're listening to Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right, hello, everybody. I'm Eric Vansel,
And I'm Daryl Sanders.
and we're your hosts for this show. So, of course, we have been promising that we were gonna do this for a long time, and of course, there's been a lot of stuff that's been going on, and if you guys saw Monday's show, we did it from Chicago. Well, at least I did.
Yeah.
You were still at home. But, I had the really cool skyline in the background. I kind of miss that, to be honest. But you know what? Back in the home studio here, we're still working on the normal studio, so Daryl and I can actually be together. That should be ready pretty soon. But, yeah, we finally... Oh, look at that. I actually have the Bad Batch graphics still up there. Oh, well. So, here's the thing that's really funny about this episode. Or not this episode, I should say this issue. And tell me if it hit you the same way. This issue was a little bit different for me. I actually found it to be a little bit more action-packed than a lot of them. And I thought that there was a lot more going on. So I don't know if you kind of felt that way or...
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would agree with that. I mean, there's a lot more action and, because it's pretty much like a lot of things happening at the same time. So it's kind of like, and that's typical Star Wars, because a lot of times you'll see that in the movies where, they may like be a ground battle, then there's a space battle, then there's like the Jedi off of here fighting some Sith Lord or something like that. So you're cutting in between all these different situations that's going on. So it definitely felt like a Star Wars.
Yeah, well, I think that that's one of the things that I really appreciated about this whole issue was the fact that it did feel more like Star Wars to me. One of the problems that I've been having with the High Republic, well, I can't even say it's really a problem because, it hasn't bothered me that much.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's the fact that it hasn't felt as much like Star Wars to me as some of the other stuff that's been coming out, even though it's been really cool. That's the thing that I find really interesting is that I thought it was cool, but it's how it actually hits me as a Star Wars comic series. So since it's been a little bit before, we've talked about this, why don't you bring us up to speed a little bit about pretty much what we've dealt with so far as the High Republic comics have gone?
Well, as we've kind of, kicked off the High Republic, we've been kind of trying to get to know some of our characters. These are some new people that we've not come in contact with before.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, getting used to some of the names and kind of their personality traits. They're a little bit different than what we're used to because we can hear the pronunciations of a lot of different things. And so now this is kind of, different in a way. But we've come to a point where in the High Republic, we have Starlight Beacon, which is like the space station. A lot of Jedi is kind of like a headquarters for them. And, they're deploying people out of there. But we kind of come into some of our main characters like SKEER, which is like a one-arm Trandoshan Jedi Master, who we've kind of seen teeter a little bit, as far as being... on the light side. And then we have Creve Trennis, Avar, Chris. Yep.
Yeah.
And then we got twins. We got Sarah and Tarrant. And, so we're coming into like, our own with some of these people. Of course, Yoda's there, but, fortunately, he's kind of in the background. So I'm glad that, he's not kind of the focal point. Because it allows us to really, know these characters.
Right. And, I just want to stop you for a second. That was one of the things that I found to be really fascinating, actually, was the fact that you didn't really, you didn't get as much Yoda as I think we initially thought we were going to get.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's me. I thought we were going to get a little bit more Yoda in this because they made such a big deal about the fact that, oh, Yoda's going to be in this, Yoda's going to be in this. And it's, I mean, what? He was in like the first issue? I mean, has he even made any appearances since the first issue?
I think he came in the second one, but either or, I mean, no, he hasn't, and that was the thing. I think he kind of came in to kind of give his opinions about something that might have been going on. And then, that was it.
Yeah, exactly. He's just kind of like, all right, well, you guys got this or whatever. But I mean, I think that's what I think has been really fascinating to me about just this whole thing. Again, not to interrupt your overview or anything, but I just thought it was really cool how they've actually been doing things that have been unexpected, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, this whole thing, we're getting to know some, not only just new characters as far as the light side or the Jedi, but now we're learning some, characters on the villainous side, Drangir, the Nile, and then, of course, we kind of see the familiar of the HUTs. And, that's kind of what brings us to this, episode, I won't say episode, this issue of the High Republic, is that now, we're starting to see more of the HUTT clan in action. And so that's kind of where we're at this point. SKEER'S can be kind of trying to train some people, and then he became, there was an issue on Siddarnis Minor. I forgot, it's something Minor.
Cedric Minor. Yeah.
Cedric Minor.
Yeah.
Cedric Minor.
Cedric Minor.
So, there's this whole situation where people are disappearing. The Jedi kind of are sensing that some, of course, there's a dark side presence going on. And then next thing you know, they're kind of snatched down this hole where they come face to face with the Drangir.
Before we get too deep into that, I just want to get to just a couple of chats Ronaldo's got going on. He said this issue felt more sentimental than the others to me because he was still kind of going in the overview thing. And then he was like, I forgot that Yoda was in this. That's the thing, is the fact that they've spaced these things out quite a bit as far as when the issues are released. And so I think that a lot of times it's really easy to forget, especially because we've been literally bombarded with all this High Republic stuff. The books are actually coming out really, really regularly. I am so behind right now. I'm still literally only halfway through the first one, and I think there's like 3 or 4 of them out. But it's just been kind of crazy. Then of course Ronaldo goes on to say there's another comic called Star Wars: The High Republic Adventures where Yoda appears more. And that's it. They're starting to branch off even in the comic series now, I noticed, which I think is actually kind of cool. But again, one of the problems that I have is that there's a danger that they might actually start to oversaturate before. And on one hand, I understand why you have to do this, because nobody really knows anything about this world. This is a brand new world. It's just been invented. And so we're not really familiar with it. So the temptation is, let's just put out a ton of material that will explain the world. But the problem is that there's so much to it, because if you remember when we did we did a couple of shows that talked about all the characters. Remember, we did the Padawans and the Masters and the villains and all that stuff. There are so many characters that you have to introduce. You almost get the DC Cinematic Universe Batman problem that we had, where in the first movie with Tim Burton, the 89 Batman, you basically just had the Joker. That was it. But then as the movie subsequently went on, they kept trying to jam more and more villains in, and the story got convoluted. So, yeah, it's been a really interesting adventure. But let's get into this issue because, like I said, this one, and it starts out right away where, you're just getting all this action. And I find it really interesting that it opens up, and it kind of does this thing about okay, here's after everything's been going on, right? So you're not really sure, because in the last issue we left off to where the HUTT came and basically said, okay, we're here or whatever, right? And the issue basically ended there. And now when you're picking it up at this issue, all of a sudden it's like this huge firefight. And you're just like, okay. And of course in the corner it says, well, after. And I just think that it's really kind of hilarious. I mean, what did you think when you first saw this whole thing go down?
Oh, well, I mean, it's like, all right, definitely you don't kind of know what's going on, because like you said, very rarely did we see it open up with a firefight. I mean, the last time we saw something like this was issue number 1, when SKEER is like jumping out at, Avar Chris, and we're just like, okay, what the heck is going on here? Like, it's kind of starts off in this whole battle, which is cool. But once again, it's still like, a Star Wars thing. A lot of times, like episode 3 started off like that, where it was just like this whole massive battle was going on, and you're just like, oh, okay. So so yeah, I mean, I really thought, it's like, okay, already off the rip, we're getting some action. You got my attention, so let's kind of see what's going on after this.
Yeah, well, and then of course after this, you have this big showdown with the HUTT, right? That the HUTT's basically like, okay, I'm here. And they talk about how pretty much it becomes like almost like a protection racket, right? I mean, it was basically one of these things where, it's like, okay, these citizens are basically providing grain and providing things for us. So now we're coming here because we realize that they're in trouble. Now, the way that it was put to them, of course, it was basically like this whole thing like, oh yeah, we're coming to help these guys because there's a thing. They're providing us with grain and all this other stuff. The Jedi see through this immediately. And
yeah, they're like, this is a bunch of crap.
Right. It's kind of like, no, basically what it is that this is the stuff that makes the precursor to Bacta. And that's pretty much what it is that you guys... What was that? What was the name of that stuff? Do you remember? They haven't used the term in a while. It was something like really obvious.
It's like relieve or something like this.
Yeah,
like
exactly. It was like, I remember when I first saw
relive. I think it's what it is. Like,
yeah, rejuve. That was it.
That's
yeah,
what
rejuve. Yeah. I remember when I first saw that, I'm like, really, guys? This is what we're gonna call it. But all right, whatever. But yeah, I thought that it was cool that, and again, one of the things I really like about this whole series of comics, and remember, we're right at the end. I believe that this is only a 6-issue run. Issue number 6 has been out for, I think, a few weeks now. So a week from today, we're going to end up reviewing that. So we had the Bad Batch episode 11 coming Monday. This is just a little bit of a sneak preview here. And then High Republic issue number 6 coming out next Friday. But we're pretty much at the end here. And so we knew that it was going to be about time to where you started seeing a little bit more of what was going on and the plan. Because if you remember in the earlier issues, one of the things that we liked about it and that we thought was really cool about it was the fact that it almost presented itself like a mystery thriller type of a thing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's one of those things where it gives you a little bit of everything. It kind of has, like you said, the mystery, the thriller part, but then now you're kind of getting a little of the the action, side of things. Now we're kind of, evolving into that space now, because like I said, things are kind of definitely heating up throughout this whole issue. It's nonstop action. And so as this comes to a close, it's expected to, you're kind of going to have kind of like a big climax at the end of this.
Yeah. Now, of course, the HUTT is basically here saying, look, you guys have to get off of our planet. Because now we're going to the before section, right? So the first panel, it's kind of like, and again, we're not necessarily going through this panel by panel. If you guys have seen any of our previous reviews, which if you haven't, you should check them out. Not right now, of course. Wait till after the video, but check them out. They're on our channel, and you can go back and look at our previous reviews. But if you basically look at the previous panel, it was talking about, okay, after, and it's this whole insane firefight. Now we're going before. And this is a little bit more of the continuation from the last issue that we would have expected to see. Because now the HUTT is basically saying, okay, they were trying to be a little sneaky about it, which I thought was cool. Like I said, they were trying to do this whole like, hey, you know, we're protecting these people, and now we're here, so you Jedi can go. We've got this. Now, SKEER, of course, being who he is, and I think it's really cool that in the last one, you find out that he had broken the mind control, and he was allowing himself to be controlled long enough to find out what the plan was. But now you're not so sure, because as we're going to see, SKEER starts out going, you know, we can't, they're trying to negotiate or whatever, and he's, once again, ready to jump into things. Which I think is a really cool thing about this thing, too, is the fact that in the High Republic, they're basically struggling with the dark side a little bit. I like the fact that the Force is used a little bit differently. It reminds me a lot, in thinking about it, of the Bad Batch. The Bad Batch differs from all the clones because they basically each have their own little ability that's enhanced. So instead of just, I mean, they're still well-rounded fighters, but instead of just being well-rounded fighters, they have one ability that's super enhanced, and that's kind of their thing. And it seems like that's how the Jedi are in the High Republic. Each one of them has essentially their own unique connection to the Force, which I find really, really cool. So, you know, I don't know what your thoughts are on all that, but I'm sure you're going to tell us.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that's, you know, you're absolutely right. You know, everybody kind of has their own thing, and then some people are still figuring out their thing too. You know, you kind of see that with, you know, Evar Chris. You know, she's still kind of, because the people are still new to the game, and so they're kind of coming up with their own thing. But you know, you got Sarah and Tarrant, who are immensely, you know, connected with each other through telekinesis and things like that. So,
you know what's funny about those guys?
Their first mind is different.
Well, they kind of remind me, it's weird. They have a Lobot kind of vibe to me.
They look like Lobot, but they kind of remind me like Wonder Twins or something like that.
Well, there is that too. But Lobot also, although he's doing it basically through a computer, and these guys are doing it through a connection. That's true. But it's weird because, again, those guys are really strange characters, but they're kind of cool. And again, one of the things that we find out in this issue, well, we've actually found out about it through the whole thing, but it's really confirmed in this issue, and that is that apart, they're a little bit weaker. So they're very much symbiotic in their relationship. And they in order to really fully connect with the Force, they need to be together. And I thought that was interesting. So again, one of the things that I really appreciate about this is the fact that they do try to come up with something unique. They're not just trying to rehash the modern Jedi and just stick them in a different era or location. Right. And in a lot of ways, I think that as time goes on, through the books, through more comics that come out, we're going to find out why the Jedi that we know from the Phantom Menace on, why they're the way that they are. Real quick, Ronaldo basically has something that he's chatting in here. He says, the twins remind me of Data from Star Trek. You know, I never really thought about that, but that is kind of true.
I mean, their look, yeah, or their vibe kind of gives you that, but they also kind of remind me of Kylo and Rey, honestly. Except for, you know, they can exist without each other, but just their connection and that whole dyad thing, you know, it seems like that's kind of where they're kind of going back to.
Well, and it makes me wonder, are we going to actually see something along those lines? Are we going to see, hey, this is the origin of the dyad and the Force? You know, because one of the things that I think is really funny about what they're doing with a lot of the newer comics and books and all the stuff that's coming out is that they're taking all these gaping plot holes in the sequel trilogy and they're trying to fill them. And they're trying to go back and retroactively explain them, which I think is just really, really funny because, I mean, if you think about it, it's not a bad idea. You know, it's not a bad plan. Because on one hand, it's messed up. You can't really reboot the thing without it just losing everybody. But if you start to fill in some of the holes, though.
Yeah. You can kind of make it make sense.
Yeah, you can kind of make it make sense. So, essentially, what's going on here, you have some of the people that are on the ship trying to overcome the Drangir, and then you have pretty much Tarek and Sarek trying to overcome this big giant rancor that, they found themselves trying to fight. And this is where you basically get the whole confirmation that, yes, these guys are connected. And at first we thought that they were just connected passively, I would say, through the Force. But one of the things that I found interesting in this issue is that they literally are weaker if they're separated. And then, of course, once they get back together, they're fully strong. Because if you remember, they spent, half of this series separated, and they were, like one of them seemed like they were near dying, and the other one was weak. And it just, I think that that's a really interesting character arc, because you would think that if the Force does bind all living things, and if it is through pretty much everything, and it's permeating all of life, pretty much, you could see where it might be a little bit of sort of this hyper acute state, wherein a couple of beings, it's almost like a Force version of Siamese twins.
Yeah.
Where they're kind of like conjoined, Where it's kind of, if they're separated, they're a little bit weaker, and if they're together, they're stronger. I think that's kind of cool. At first, I'll be honest, I don't know what I was making of these guys. They seemed a little too weird and a little too outside Star Wars. When Ronaldo said that he reminds him of Data of Star Trek, I wasn't so much really reminded of Data as much as, what it actually reminded me of was the bald chick in the very, very first Star Trek movie, Star Trek the Motion Picture. Because, and it had that sort of cold, clinical, sci-fi kind of vibe to it to me.
Well, these two also kind of remind me of, for those of you who've seen the movie Hancock, where,
yes.
It's like where, like, okay, he's with that chick, and like, they're actually, like, the further away they get from each other, the stronger they are, and it's kind of like that, and this on the backwards kind of way. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting way. Like I said, they're trying to create something new, something we've never seen in Star Wars, but keeping it relative. And, so far, so good.
Well, and that's the problem. The problem is, it's such a fine line. And especially with the way that the fan base is right now, it is so, you have to be so careful. I do not envy these guys in the least when they're coming up with these stories, because, and you almost have to tune it out. Because otherwise, everything that you put on here, you're going to start going, okay, are the fans going to like this? Are they going to hate this? What are they going to say about that?
Right.
And you're going to drive everybody insane if you do that. And I think that what you have to do is you do have to try to bring in some newer elements. But the trick, and we've brought this up a million different times, the trick is that you have to strike a very, very careful balance between bringing in new elements and expanding the universe, but making it feel familiar, though. And I think that that's some of the problems where we saw it in the sequel trilogy, where sometimes, maybe like in Rian Johnson's case, even though I thought it was good, maybe it went a little bit too far trying to be different. And in J.J. Abrams' case, maybe he went a little too far trying to be familiar and fan servicey. And I can't help but think that maybe there's a balance somewhere in the middle. And that's why so far with the High Republic, I really like what they're doing. I like the characters. I'm invested in them now. And I think it's cool, even though, to be completely honest, I'm still trying to commit a lot of these guys' names to memory.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
There's like so many of them. You know, and it's just
yeah.
It's just crazy. Okay, so now we have, you know, this comic panel, which I thought was really kind of cool. You know, we have the whole release the HUTT. I basically, it's almost like releasing the Kraken. What's happening here, though, is that SKEER has decided that he's going to do things a little bit differently, right? They tried to trap him, and now he's essentially going dark again.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this whole tug of war that SKEER'S been basically experiencing the whole time. It actually started in the very first issue. And that was one of the things that I thought was really cool about this series, too, is that even when people are having this tug of war between the light and the dark, it's done in a very different way from what we've seen in the original trilogy.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, he's actually doing the tug of war literally, too, with this whole plant arm that he still has. And
yeah.
that he got from the Dringear.
Right. And he's basically... Well, and that's the thing. His mind is still being somewhat controlled by the Dringear, and I think that this is kind of cool because you have to remember that they're fighting all of these people on different fronts, right? You have the Nile,
Mm-hmm.
who's basically over this whole plan. Then they're battling the HUTT for the control of the planet. The Dringear are basically fighting everybody. And
yeah, they're inhabiting and stuff.
Yeah, and they're inhabiting people, and it becomes almost like this zombie type of a thing in a way. And it's a very different thing than what we've seen in Star Wars. That's another thing that I think is really cool about this, is that you don't usually see stuff like this. You know, you basically, I mean, Star Wars is usually very much, I mean, it's on the fantasy realm, but this is almost a different kind of fantasy than what we're normally used to seeing. And that's what I think is actually so refreshing about it. But what did you... Like, when you first started seeing SKEER kind of going back to his, shall I say, Drangearish type of ways, I mean, what did you think?
Well, I mean, it didn't really quite surprise me just because the nature of his character anyway has always been kind of aggressive. And I think that's just part of his, genetic makeup as a Trandoshan. It's almost kind of like a Klingon. Like, you just expect them to be more aggressive just because they're Klingons. You know what I mean? However, like, the fact that he still has like this plant arm, so that didn't fall off. He kind of still is utilizing that, and that was from the Dringear. So it's kind of like, it doesn't surprise me that, he still has some sort of connection to them.
Right. And I mean, the thing is, and this is the danger of it, right, is that he basically was letting them control him a little bit in order to get the information, in order to figure out what it was that they wanted, how to destroy them, so on and so forth. But it's almost like they got a little bit too much a hold of him.
Yeah.
And now he's got to fight
comfort.
and now he's got to fight their influence. And I think that is just a really, really cool thing. And it's funny because, first of all, Ronaldo said that Hancock reference was spot on, by the way. And he was saying it's the most agile HUTT he's ever seen. One of the things that I like about this, too, is that the HUTTs are doing a little bit more. They're not just sitting on their dais or whatever.
Thrones.
And they're actually active and they're out there doing something, which I think is really important, because one of the problems that I've always had is that you start to think, like, why are these guys so powerful? I mean, obviously they have their minions and their all the bounty hunters, but why are all these guys listening to them? I mean, granted, a lot of times, you see that in a lot of old-time gangster situations where you have some like 80-year-old guy that's basically running everything, and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, well, any of these guys could take him.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, they represent order or whatever. But here we actually see a very different HUTT. And I think that that's one of the things that's really cool that they did promise us, by the way, is that they were going to give us HUTTs and other familiar characters that were a little bit different from what we've seen in previous incarnations. And I think that that's one of the improvements that they're making in this whole thing. And I for one, am really excited about it. So now, we go to where the Jedi now had to come in and try to help SKEER, because he's basically being trapped and he's fighting and he's trying to fight this influence and all that. And this is where you get another thing that I really love about the High Republic Jedi, is that they're very much united in purpose. They're very much together, and I can see now why they basically had said that this is the zenith and the peak of the Jedi and their influence and everything else, because they are just so united in purpose. And even though they do have a few different ideas about the nature of the Force, that I think is brought on more by the fact that everybody kind of has their connection and their thing, and it's about how to coexist with that. Whereas the Jedi that we see in the current times, well, it is a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, but I mean, in the trilogies, the movies, all the stuff that we've seen up until now, right? I guess what we would call the Skywalker saga. What we've seen of the Jedi then is they're very much cookie cutter. They're very, very uniform. They're almost like Jedi version of the clones. They have, they do everything the same way, the same. They're taught the same. They're executing things the same. Yes, they do have different fighting forms and things like that, but essentially everything is the same. Whereas the Jedi of the High Republic seem to celebrate difference and diversity. And everybody has their own approach to the Force, and nobody's really trying to say that one approach is more correct than the other. And so that, I think, is creating some sort of a sense of unity. And so that's one of the things that I think is really cool about this particular era.
Yeah, I think you hit it all right on the head. I mean, this era does, you can tell just by the way they all look, like Padawans, you're kind of used to them kind of having, they kind of have like kind of a uniform look, if you can, especially like the humans. But, you got, some sporting like, gosh, she's got like a mohawk thing going. You got another one with like Great Storm's got like long flowing. I mean, it's just,
yeah, that's
everybody
true.
kind of has their own thing, like their own look. Everybody's not, like you said, so cookie cutter, like in the traditional sense where we're used to seeing the Jedi and the Skywalker saga. Yeah, you have people kind of like are embracing, and I think I think what Star Wars is doing is embracing the current times right now, where everybody's kind of trying to accept everyone's differences, whether you're LGBTQ plus whatever, and you got, black here, you got white here, you got Latino here. Everybody's trying to like be this giant melting pot, and I think they're trying to bring that into Star Wars as well, to show that you have women who are powerful, you have men who are powerful, you have everyone's powerful, and everybody has their own special, unique thing to them. Even in the Bad Batch, that's kind of showing that too. So people who are once considered castaways are now embracing, and you can see what they can do as a unit. And so, it's a positive thing, that I've seen it in Star Wars, which has always been there. But in this particular issue, yeah, you're seeing some different things, like we see the return of the double-bladed lightsabers, which you really haven't seen a whole lot of. Maul was kind of the only one we saw do this, but that's actually a whole fighting style with having two separate blades. It's called like Jakai. That's kind of a whole fighting system. So we already even know about the traditional 7 fighting forms of the Jedi, but now you also have to add this one to it. So, it's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I definitely agree that they have to, they I think what it comes down to is the fact that they're trying to do something a little bit different than what they've done in the past. But at the same time, I think that they're also trying to celebrate what has come before it as well, right? So one a good example that you brought up that honestly, I didn't even think about, man. I honestly didn't even think about it. And that is that they did actually make the Padawans different. I didn't even think about that. But yet the Padawans all have different looks. And I think part of that comes from the fact that before you pretty much had the whole war versus the lore. That was kind of how everybody was dividing Star Wars back, with everything else, right? But I think that one of the key factors is that you essentially have a different sort of an attitude when you're dealing with this time period, simply because there's an absence of a whole galactic war that wasn't really necessarily the case when you're dealing with the Skywalker saga. And I think that much like with the Bad Batch, now granted it was similar, but you went from having essentially a free kind of a democratic or libertarian type society that basically, a republic, right? That is trying to do the right thing or whatever, and then they get wrapped up in this war. When they come out of it, now they're basically a fascist government. And so now it's how are the citizens dealing with this? How are the clones, who basically once were fighting for a completely different government? I mean, it's the same government, but they're fighting for a completely different government. When the High Republic, you essentially have a complete absence of that. Pretty much everything's fine. They have a slightly different structure. I mean, the Republic is there, obviously, but you pretty much have these skirmishes and these different villains or whatever that pop up. But, that's just, I think, the main difference that I see is the fact that you have the absence of a galactic war, and that's going to affect greatly how everything, pretty much works out. So from there, now you get the citizens. So you remember these guys, because you had this dude who was pretty much, they were
scammer.
Yeah, he was pretty much a scammer. He was a taskmaster. If they weren't fighting or whatever, they were basically like, he was beating them. I mean, he was pretty much a slave driver. And all these guys were afraid of him, and now he's trying to get out of there. And now they're coming back to him and saying, no, you know what? Because of you, our kid's dead. Our families are torn apart. And now they're coming and they're basically, hitting him.
Yeah, literally.
And right. And I thought that was a great thing to deal with, because so often when the good guys come and they save the day, all the victims or whatever kind of run toward them and, board their ship or do whatever. But this is something that you see quite a bit, because these citizens are basically taking their planet back. That's what it comes down to. Once you have this revolt and everything else, and they're basically, now their eyes are open, because remember, before they just thought that, okay, this is a little bit unfair or whatever, but they thought that what they were doing was pretty much what they were supposed to. Then they realized they were being duped. They were being tricked. And they're not reacting too well to it. And I thought that was actually a really cool thing too, because usually you don't see that kind of thing portrayed much in a lot of these stories.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was the cool thing about watching the Clone Wars animation, Rebels, even the Bad Batch now, the episodes we're on now when they're on Ryloth. You're seeing how things are affecting the actual people of these planets. You're seeing how these things are like, no, this is how we feel. Because before, we're used to just the heroes as the good guys versus the bad guys. But to see things from the people's perspective, how it's affecting them. One of the great things I loved, and Marvel did a superb job in doing this, is that whole, Sokovia Accord thing that they came up with, when it's like, okay, yeah, everybody's cheering for these heroes, but it's like, okay, these buildings are torn down, people died with these heroes trying to save them. We didn't ask them to save them, or did you guys come up with a plan, and did you guys coordinate? Could this have been done better without us losing so many lives? So you're seeing how people, a lot of different mediums are starting to show how the people who the heroes are supposed to be protecting are affected by the decisions of these heroes.
Exactly. By the way, I should point out that the reason why there are 3 S's in issue is in honor of Skeer. In our graphic.
Yes.
Speaking of Skeer, so now,
right.
now they're trying to reach him, right? It's basically like, okay, Padawan's basically like, look, Skeer, pretty much this isn't you. You got to fight this, and he has a little bit of lucidity pop in where he's himself again. And what's interesting is he reveals that, you know what? I've been losing my connection to the Force. And he's been saying, and, of course, she's like, well, of course you have, because you've been under the control of the Drangir. But it's like, no, even before that. And he basically went on to talk about this lesson back in issue number 1, where there was this whole dark side presence. He didn't even sense it. Then when they landed on this planet, he didn't sense it there either. He was starting to lose his ability. Now, I'm really curious on where they're going with that, because to me, that mirrors a lot when the Jedi of the Skywalker saga, when it was being blocked by Palpatine, and they were completely unaware of it. But here, Skeer's kind of like, there's some things, and I'm glad that somebody finally did this too, because one of the things, as you know, that's always bothered me about the Skywalker saga movies is that Lucas was very selective about when they would sense things and when they wouldn't. Or when they would use some crazy, insane power and then when they wouldn't. And where you're just sitting there thinking, like, for example, two of the biggest ones that come to mind all the time are when Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan and Jar Jar are being chased by the fish. And it's like, come on, you guys didn't sense that? They're these, like, giant living beings. You'll sense all these other little, tiny, minute things, but something that big you're not sensing, that's very convenient. Now, granted, I get it. It's to build suspense and all this other stuff. This is where we're actually leaving the in-universe explanations and getting more to the storytelling devices and things like that. The second big one, there's a couple of them, but another one that comes to mind is that Luke comes into Jabba's palace, and I mean, he's choking Gamorrean guards. He's obviously very powerful. Then he gets down and he falls into the Rancor pit. Rancor comes out, and you're just like, okay, man, you're pretty powerful now. You could probably force choke this thing. You can explode its heart. You can force push it. You could do something. Instead,
you didn't even need the stone, to throw at the little thing. You could have just hit the switch with the Force.
Exactly. So many different things. What does this guy do? He grabs a bone and goes up. And it's very, don't get me wrong, it was resourceful. But at the same time, you know what I'm saying? It's like they're very, very selective about when they use the Force. And I like the fact that you don't really get that much in the High Republic. The High Republic, they're a little bit more forthcoming, and they're a little bit more, better, I think, at conveying these stories, because this is something that happens a lot of times too, where you'll get oh, the Jedi just magically loses connection with the Force when it's convenient for the story. But in this, it basically seems like, once again, this is a result of planning. They actually have an idea of what they're trying to do with this. And I really appreciate that. I really like the fact that they're obviously setting something up. Now, what I'm curious about, and you guys out there, you can, if you're still watching this live, you can chat it in live if you know, or certainly put it in the comments section. And that is, I wonder exactly how much material you have to read in order to understand all the stories. Because I know with the Light of the Jedi book that I'm reading, there's a little bit of a precursor to what's happening in this comic series. And I'm sure what happens in this comic series might drift off and maybe be referenced again or something in some of the books. But my question becomes, do you actually have to read every little High Republic thing to get all the information? Or are they going to divide it up so comic book readers, there's going to be like a comic book thread, and then for the novel readers, and then of course for people who are reading both, maybe you'll get little Easter eggs here and there, but it's not like you have to, you had to have read this comic series before you jump into some novel, for example.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, one with Star Wars, I mean, with the different mediums that they're putting out content, whether it's comics, whether it's the books, whether it's, it's like, it's kind of all over. I mean, I don't quite like that. I kind of like, at least when you're starting off something brand new, it's kind of funnel us down through a point, and then you can spread out. But, so I figured I would have preferred the books. Mm-hmm. And then after the books, then start doing comics. And then, so then now it's like, okay, it's kind of a gradual follow. But when you're releasing stuff all over the place, it's like, oh, when did that come out? Like when, Ronaldo's brought up to like the whole, the adventures of, I'm like, well, what the heck is that now?
Right.
So it's like, you
have multiple comic series. You have all these different books that are coming out, because you have the normal ones, but then you also have the young adult series that are coming out.
And you got to figure out where in the story is everything taking place.
Exactly.
Because in the comics, you're in one way, the books you're somewhere else. And then this young adult, it's kind of like, it's hard to follow that way.
Well, I think that's one of the dangers, honestly, of something being introduced in this format versus in movies. See, the nice thing about the whole Star Wars universe period is that we were introduced to it in the films. So you basically had the original trilogy. And then once that, even when that was still kind of at its tail end or whatever, you started having some books and comics that were filtering out here and there. But you had the universe established in a very visual medium, which I think helps. I think it helps if people can see it. Like, for instance, what I think they should have done, granted, I can understand they're not going to want to sink a couple $100 million and kick out a bunch of High Republic movies. What they should have done was come out with an animated series. They should have just done an animated series, let it go a season, at least, if not two, but at least one full season, and then start to spawn off your books and your comics and stuff like that. Because I think that by having an actual visual reference, it might help people understand, and it's going to help you commit a lot more of this stuff to memory. Because remember, maybe not so much in comics, but definitely in books, everybody's going to interpret these things a different way. Everybody's using their imagination, and they're going to see things in a slightly different way. Now, that's not as bad with Star Wars because we all have a frame of reference. So if a book happens to mention Vader's castle, for instance, we all know what that looks like. So we're all using the same visual reference point. But, you come up with all these other different worlds, everybody's going to see it a little bit differently. That's the magic and the beauty of books, actually. It's one of the reasons why I like them. Because it's partially your imagination that's either limiting you or expanding your enjoyment of something. That's one of the reasons why I like the Star Wars books. But
yeah,
I digress. So now we get to the point of the story where the Jedi's basically going to the HUTTs like, look, guys, all of us are pretty much in trouble here if we keep fighting each other because the Drengir pretty much want to kill us all. So,
basically.
and we're not really going to be defeating them on our own, and you're not going to defeat them on your own, so we basically have to band together. And this is another thing that I think is really cool. And it really brings me back to a little bit of the Yuuzhan Vong series in the old expanded universe. Because the way that the expanded universe worked, you had the Republic, you had the New Republic, led by Mon Mothma, Leia, and all them. And you still had the Imperial remnants. And basically there was a whole truce that took place where the Empire could pretty much have their own little area of the galaxy that they could do whatever they want. So it was their section. It's like, look, y'all can have this area of the galaxy. As long as you don't mess with us or do anything weird, you guys can live in peace and do whatever. And there was a point where the Yuuzhan Vong were starting to get so bad. And of course, the Empire were more or less off the radar, right? Because they were I think they were in the Outer Rim somewhere, actually. They were kind of off the grid. And so the Yuuzhan Vong didn't really pay much attention to them at first. They did later, but not at first. And of course, the Empire's like, cool. You know, the New Republic's getting wiped out. It's kind of what we wanted anyway. Well, there came a point where Leia and all them were going, look, guys, if you think that they're going to stop at us, you're crazy. Because once they defeat us, they're coming after you. And at first, you know, Paleon, because Thrawn was gone at this point, so Admiral Paleon kind of, who was Thrawn's right-hand man at that time, he basically rose to the leader of the Empire at that point. And he finally understood because then he saw that some of his outposts and things like that were starting to be attacked. So, long story short, they ended up banding together. Not that it did a whole lot of good, but they saw that they had a common enemy. And they're bringing that concept back here where you pretty much have the HUTTs who are very proud because their whole thing is like, look, you're not going to get all of our families and all this stuff to unite in purpose and all that. But then they realize that, look, there's an enemy here that we can't defeat. So, I mean, I thought that was actually a really cool thing.
Yeah, it's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You know,
exactly.
That's basically what it boils down to. And I think, you know, it's always cool and interesting to see how that, like, look, I know we don't agree, but we don't like each other, but, you know, we really don't like them. You know, it's like we can't get back to doing what we normally do if neither one of us are around. So it's in our best interest to, you know, band together. And it's always interesting to see that struggle and that tug of war, you know, between the two sides, you know, because they have to figure out how they're going to coexist and trust each other.
And that's basically, once again, a tried and true storytelling technique. I mean, we're seeing it in Cobra Kai.
Yep.
Johnny and Daniel had to put aside their differences to unite against Kreese, and now Terry Silver and all these guys. So, I mean, it's a storytelling thing that they use all the time because it's interesting, because it's fascinating, and because it's based a little bit into reality. Okay, so now the Jedi, I think, actually use like this really cool thing, and that is they pretty much use Sskeer, and through Sskeer to communicate with the rest of them, they convince the Drengir that the flesh, all this flesh that they're eating, which is basically all these people, is rotten and poisonous, and it's going to kill them if they keep doing it. So the Drengir end up basically breaking off the attack everywhere. And that's one of those things that you always see this in a bunch of stuff. You saw this in V and V the Final Battle. You see this in zombie movies. You see this whenever you have a whole mass, or maybe like the Blob or something. All these different movies or different things where you have this just overwhelming force, and you have to come up with something. You have to find some weakness, something, because obviously you can't beat this thing with any kind of military might.
Mm-hmm.
They're not strong enough to defeat it. So now they have to outthink these things. And again, this is one of the things that I started as I was reading this issue. I was like, I would like to see this. I would like to see this, either animated, movie, or whatever. Now I'm starting, because at first, with issue 1 and 2, I was like, I liked it. Don't get me wrong. I really enjoyed it, but I was still trying to process it. And I remember the first couple of reviews that we did, that's what you and I kept saying. Yeah, I'm still processing this.
Mm-hmm.
But now that I have somewhat of a foundation with these guys, now I'm starting to actually see this stuff like a film. Now I'm starting to really absorb the story and really get into what it's about. And I mean, I just thought that was a really cool idea, because, and you do this all the time. If you've noticed, there's always a point whenever this kind of a device, storytelling device, is used, you're always like, man, I have no idea how they're going to defeat these guys.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's so many movies that I have always just gone in and have just said, yeah, man, I don't know how they're going to get out of this one. And you even feel for the writers. You feel for the writers. You're like, how are they going to do this? I mean, you have essentially painted yourself, at least it seems that way. You've painted yourself into this corner. How are you going to get out of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's always cool when they have something slick up their sleeve just to kind of like turn the tide,
Mm-hmm.
and they use their greatest ally, which is the Force, and being able to channel that through Skeer, who already has a connection to the Drengear. So he's like that conduit to kind of talk to him. So, yeah, I mean, I thought it was a brilliant move. And, now you kind of have to wonder, like, all right, I mean, it's not, I know we know it's not going to be the last of the Drengear. So, what's next?
Well, and a lot of people have been just talking about how this new batch of books that have just come out are just insanely cool. That the Nile are just like ridiculous, and the Drengear and all this stuff. So I've been reading this stuff and I've been thinking, man, I'm not even through the first book yet. I've got to get going and get through this first book, because right now it's basically kind of how the comics were at first, for the first 2 issues or 3, and pretty much the first half of the series, where it was a little bit more world building than anything else. Now I'm getting really, really excited about this. So essentially, we leave things off where Skeer seems like maybe he's not well.
He's not in the best of shape.
He's not in the best of shape. It's kind of like when, and this makes sense because, again, the Drengear were very much a part of his mind. I mean, he, as you pointed out earlier, he even had the ability to, well, I mean, he's Trandoshan, so he was able to regenerate anyway, but he was able to conjure up all these limbs and do all this stuff. So the Drengear actually had a really good foothold into his mind. So when this whole ruse came up, it does make sense that, I mean, I think he's dead? Of course not. But I think what's happening is it did take a lot out of him. Now, here's the $1 million question, though. How is this going to affect his connection to the Force? Because they did go through the trouble of saying and trying to foreshadow, oh yeah, I've been losing my connection to the Force for a little while now. And talking about, resisting the dark. And of course, Skeer not only is revealing that he's been losing his connection to the Force, but it seems like he's had this duality going on, where he's normally the very in control and wise teacher, and he's this Jedi master kind of guy, and then all of a sudden, he turns into this really angry, almost Anakin, just jump right into it, and react more with emotion than with wisdom and everything else that you get from the other part of his personality. So it really makes me wonder now, when you take all that together, and now you see this, where do you think that's going to take us?
Well, I think that's just going to unravel like another mystery once again. I think we have to find out now, why is his connection to the Force diminishing? I think that's when he's going to probably seek the High Council, I'm saying, as far as the Jedi Council, as far as that's concerned, because they probably will be the next logical step for them, because of course they're like Grand Masters of the Force. Mm-hmm. So maybe we'll see some things with Yoda. Maybe we'll get into kind of like the ideology of this generation of the High Republic as far as it pertains to the Force. I mean, I'm looking to see if they delve into that. So that's just my guess.
Yeah, and I mean, overall, I think that, yes, there's definitely going to be more. I mean, I think that they're going to wrap this up very similar to what they did with The Mandalorian. So The Mandalorian Season 2 seemed to wrap up the whole Grogu thing. And now they're going to move on to another chapter. Whether that includes Grogu or not, that remains to be seen. But the whole idea where I have to protect the child and all that stuff, that pretty much got wrapped up. And I think that that's what's going to happen here. I think that this little contained story with Sendry Minor is done. And now they're going to have to move on to the next phase. But Ronaldo was saying, because he's had actually a few chats in here, he was like, it's refreshing to have a story without necessarily having a war. And I agree wholeheartedly. I think that one of the things that makes this so fascinating to me is that you're basically seeing the galaxy pretty much with some semblance of peace. And that's something we've never really seen before. Maybe a little bit at the beginning of Phantom Menace, but not really, because while the galaxy at large was relatively at peace, we were seeing all the players positioning their pieces and getting ready to pretty much wreck everything. So it was kind of different. But here, the Jedi aren't necessarily generals or not. They literally are keepers of the peace, and that's what we're seeing.
Definitely.
He goes on to say, referencing something earlier, remember when things like that happen, just think it was not the will of the Force. And that's the thing. I don't think a lot of this stuff is necessarily the will of the Force, but it does seem like it helps people with their connection to the Force. It seems like maybe in a macro sense, but not in a micro sense, it might be the will of the Force. That's really interesting. I don't know. It's almost like we got to do a part 2 of that whole discussion. Although, which makes sense, because honestly, the whole Force discussions have been the ones that have gotten the most views. He goes on to say, well, what I have read, the case of the comics, I feel it is not necessary to read the books to understand them. It helps to understand the story a little better, but it's not necessary, I think, which is good. I'm glad, because I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to have time. He goes on to say, I don't really see SKEER surviving this. I don't think he's dead now, but I think he will die in the next few chapters, or at least he will lose all connection with the Force and abandon the Order. That's kind of interesting to me too, because they've introduced this whole gang of characters in this whole thing, right? I mean, if you're taking not just the comic series, but if you just take the High Republic as a whole, between the books and the comics that have been released so far. I haven't even been keeping track of it that much, but if you just look at back when we did our show on, well, here's all the Jedi Masters, and here's all the Padawans, and here's all the villains, and all the locations and things like that, it's pretty big. It's not like they're doing it the way Lucas introduced us into this world. When Lucas introduced us into the world, we saw it first through the droids, and then you started to add the people. It was very much of a Wizard of Oz-like thing, right? You start out with Dorothy, then Dorothy meets the Scarecrow, then they meet the Tin Man, and on it goes. And pretty soon you have this this
band
king.
of characters.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Well, that's sort of what happened with the original trilogy. As the movies went on, too, we met more new characters that we added to our roster of familiar ones.
Mm-hmm.
With the High Republic, though, they're kind of doing that, but first of all, you're meeting a different set of characters in book 1 than you do in issue number 1 of the comic. It kind of goes back to something you had said, where they're just all over the map as far as where you're being dropped in. It's not necessarily very linear. Now, I'm sure maybe as it converges down the line, maybe the stories from the books and then the comics and as a whole, maybe they converge at some point. Because remember, the writers did have a plan. They did actually they all sat down in a room together and they had a little powwow and they came up with this whole story, and then they divvied it up and said, okay, you take this, you take that, I'll take this. So it's not like what we experienced with the sequel trilogy. But at the same time, I don't know.
Yeah, we gotta wait and see.
Yeah,
it's too early to tell. I mean, like I said, this is only the first, series of things that's coming out from this. So we kind of have to let it kind of flesh out a little bit more before we can really truly say, like, yeah, this is a bad idea.
Well, that's true. And to be honest and to be fair, maybe if we read everything that had been released so far, we might be having a different conversation.
That's true as well.
A lot of it is that, we've barely had time to even keep up with this stuff. I mean, look,
right.
issue number 6 has been out for a few weeks, and we're still doing 5. That's why we're trying to catch up with this stuff. So, that's just kind of the way it goes. But let us know what you guys thought of issue number 5. And be sure to revisit all of our other reviews. And you can do that right here on our YouTube channel while you subscribe and while you hit that like button. And make sure you hit the notification bell, because we do these reviews from time to time. Had to get the little C-3PO movement
3PO,
in there.
bro.
Yeah. I mean, we do... Usually every Monday, we try to review something. We're in the middle of the Bad Batch. This coming Monday at 8 o'clock, we're going to be doing episode 11, which actually dropped today. Next Friday at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, we're going to be doing issue number 6 of the High Republic. And maybe that's going to be the whole little wrap-up and everything else, so you guys aren't going to want to miss that. So make sure that you check out all of our past reviews on everything that we've done here, so you guys can catch up and be ready for when we do issue number 6 next week. So until Monday, till the Bad Batch. Have you seen the Bad Batch yet?
Yep.
Okay, I haven't. I've read about it. Okay. I cheated. I read about it. But of course, I'm going to watch it before our fantastic review Monday night. So until then, guys, hopefully you'll come back and join us then. Hopefully you have a good rest of your weekend. I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the Force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.